Welcome to this month's installment of the Riley Blake Table Topper of the Month. This month we're working on Mayflowers, which will finish at a 36 by 36 inch table topper. We are going to be focusing on this month how to do fusible machine applique. So to get started, you want to follow your instructions on page 1 of your pattern to cut all of your fabrics. Don't cut your shapes yet, your petals. We're going to talk about how to do that in just a moment. You are going to need some double-sided fusible applique for this project, whether you use Heat and Bond Light, Steam-A-Seam. Our preferred favorite is either Shades Textiles Soft Fuse or OESD's Soft Web. Both of them leave a very light hand and are not going to make your table topper stiff. We don't have to worry too much because nothing in this table topper is applique on top applique. But just to think about, if you were doing applique on top applique, you have to count that layer of fusible as like another layer of fabric. So the more layers you go up, the thicker and stiffer it's going to feel. So you may need to take that into consideration for your project. You can also do window fusible, which we can talk about as well in just a moment. So go get your stuff cut and then meet me back here and we will talk about how to trace and prep your petals for fusible applique. Want to cut your pieces of fusible applique, you can leave them as a full sheet. The fusible paper that you're planning to use, you can leave it as a full sheet and randomly trace all the shapes onto one big piece and then cut them apart. Or you can cut yourself some rectangles or squares. You will save some fusible if you leave it as one piece and trace your necessary requirements of petals. You are going to need 4 petals cut out of your orange blossom. You will need 8 petals cut out of raspberry and 4 petals cut out of green. So you're going to need to trace 12 of the petal shapes that you can find on page 5 of your pattern onto the paper side of the fusible. I'm going to lay it on top of my shape. I'm working with the paper side. The back side of this is, think of it as a thin sheet of glue. Okay, I'm going to put a little tape here to hold this down for me because it wants to curl up. And then we're going to trace. You can do this right on top of the table like I'm at. If you have a hard time seeing through the paper and seeing the line you need to trace, you may find a light box helpful or even up against like a sliding glass window. I'm going to trace my 12 petals. I prefer to use a fine tip Sharpie. I don't like to use a pencil because when you go to iron this in a little bit, you will end up with leaving some of that lead on the bottom of your iron. It also smears. Ballpoint pen will work as well, but I really like the super fine line that you're going to get from a fine tipped Sharpie. Don't worry if it's not super straight or jagged. When you go to cut this out with a pair of scissors, you can make sure that it's right. Okay. What we're going to do is I peel this up. I'm going to rough cut the excess fusible away from the traced line. Okay, I don't want to cut on the line, I just want to cut the excess off. Okay, so you have this. You're going to get your fabric pieces. You're going to take this to the wrong side of the fabric. Place the glue side to the wrong side of the fabric, and we're going to iron. Make sure that you look at the instructions for the fusible that you purchased, because you can over iron fusibles. If you over iron fusible, it won't stick, okay? It's kind of like you burn it and then it won't stay attached. So you want to be cautious that your iron's not too hot. We're going to give this a good press so that it stays attached to your fabric. Once you have all your petals fused to the wrong side of the fabric, you can take your scissors and cut out on the line so that you'll have your petal shape all ready to be fused. My paper is still attached to the back, and you're going to repeat that process 12 times. Now, I had talked about if you were going to be doing multiple layers or didn't really like the stiff feeling, you can do a technique that we call window applique. And basically what we do is we take our shape and we're going to remove the inside section of our applique. Okay, this we wouldn't need. We would then take and iron this to our fabric and then cut out on the line. So it only leaves about 1/4 inch of fusible around the outside edge of our applique, while allowing you to leave this center empty, especially if you were going to go and fuse something in addition into the middle. Doing your fusibles this way, we'd have fusible fabric, whereas if you were using this technique, it would just be fabric, fabric, and fusible. So a little less stiffness will happen. So go ahead, let's work on getting your 12 petals traced, fused, and cut, and then we'll talk about assembly. Okay, here's the one petal that's all the way, and then this just gives you an idea. This is my window applique option as well, so you can see the difference. They both will end in the same result. Now, in the pattern, they have you apply these petals to your background squares. I'm going to demonstrate how they have you do it, and then I'm going to give you a suggestion on a different way to do it. So, in the pattern, they want you to place this petal on the diagonal so that it is 1/4 inch away from the corner. So I would take a ruler and I would mark myself 1/4 inch just in the corner. Now this is a this is a heat erasable pen. You could use water, you could use chalk, but I'm just marking that 1/4 inch. And I'm going to do the same in the opposite corner. What we're doing is we're trying to give us some identifiers that we don't want the petal to end up outside of this line, because then it's going to be caught in the seam allowance when we go to assemble the center. So you want to get your petal kind of positioned so that it sits right there at that 1/4 inch point. Okay. The same goes for both the solid squares and the half square triangles that they have you make. So make sure on page 2 you look at the instructions for assembling the half square triangles, because the center of our square is made up of an assortment of the pink blossom on white, the peony blossom, and then half square triangles made of both. All of these should be squared down to the measurement that is indicated on page 2 of our instructions. Once you have your petals your squares marked, okay, we need to apply your fusible petal to this fabric. So a lot of us want to start picking at the edge to get this fusible off. And you can do that, but that's going to start to ravel the edge of your applique and probably not look the prettiest. So I suggest that you take just a straight pin, score a line through the middle. So all I did was drag across the middle to tear the paper. Okay, and then I can start getting the paper off from the center of my block and allowing myself to preserve my nice, clean, fused cut edges. Okay, and then we can apply this to the background using the iron, and again, the same settings that you would use if you were applying your fusible the first time. Okay, and you're going to repeat this process with every square, background square, and every petal. Make sure that you pay attention to the instructions showing you which petals are supposed to go onto which backgrounds. Now that your petals are fused to your background, the next step in this process would be to applique them down with the stitch or technique of your choice. Definitely would not do this by hand. With the fusible behind the petal, it can be a little hard to get a needle through, depending on what you're doing. So I'm going to show you blanket stitch by sewing machine. I'm going to be using a Bernina today. This technique is the same on any Bernina, pretty much no matter how young or old it is. My preferred foot for blanket stitching is foot 20C. Or 20, depending on, or 20D, depending on where you are in the world of Bernina. 20 is basically an open toe foot. There is no bar across the middle here so that you can see where you're going. We are going to be using a blanket stitch. So here is my number 20 foot. My blanket stitch, depending upon your machine, and what you have and where it's at, but in my current line machines, your blanket stitch is going to be found in the quilt program, and it is going to be stitch number 1329. 1330 for some of you is going to be a double blanket stitch. It's going to stitch itself twice, so if you want it to have a little bit more of a hand look, you may, or using with thicker thread, you may want to choose that one, but you may want to also experiment as well. Now, if we leave this stitch in the center, we're going to have a hard time trying to keep this straight edge of the blanket stitch on the raw edge of our fabric. So when I blanket stitch, I choose my blanket stitch, and then I'm going to move my needle position to the far right so that the straight edge of this blanket stitch is on the right hand edge of the presser foot. Okay. In terms of using stitch width and stitch length for your project, it's really your personal preference as to how big or small you would like this stitch to be. You don't want to go too large because it will be a little challenging to get right into the corner, but if you space it far enough apart or don't go too far in, you may not catch your fabric. So it's just a personal preference. When I did our sample, I stitched with a 3 width and a 3 length. I do like it when both numbers are the same. It's just it's just my personal preference. We're going to do 3.1 here on the computer screen, but on my actual sewing machine, we're going to be at a 3. And then we're going to get ourselves set to stitch. In your needle, you want to put a thread color of your choice. We matched thread colors in the 50 weight cotton to each fabric of our petal. And in my bobbin, I have a neutral color thread. I would suggest testing this stitch first. You may find you need to put a piece of tearaway stabilizer behind this because you may get some puckering. You may find that you need to adjust either upper tension or bobbin tension on your machine if the bobbin thread is coming to the top. It's just going to depend upon your machine, okay? In terms of adjusting bobbin tension, for my machines that use, let me grab a bobbin case. Let's see if I have one. For my 8 series machines, you would want to thread your machine like embroidery. For my 7 series machines, my current line 7 and 5 series machines, my 4 series machines, you may opt to use your gold bobbin case. This bobbin case is going to increase your lower tension and force the upper thread to come to the back. If you have the traditional bobbin case with the little stitch finger on it, if you've ever noticed that there is a hole in that stitch finger, and that hole is designed for you to be able to thread your bobbin from the back of the bobbin case through the front, out through that hole, and that's going to increase your bobbin tension and force the upper thread to come to the back of this. This is going to be helpful in that aspect because sometimes in a blanket stitch, you may find that the bobbin thread just wants to peek up on the top as you take a bite into your applique. So it's just going to be, I would suggest testing. We are starched. I'm not using stabilizer on mine because my background has been starched stiff. Okay, so that eliminates the need. You could also, if you wanted to apply a piece of fusible woven lining, SF101, to the back of your background fabrics as well, and that can take place of needing a necessary stabilizer. The stabilizer, again, the starch or the SF101, is designed to help keep this from wanting to pucker and shrink on you. So take a moment, let's get our machine set up and get it threaded, and then we'll start stitching. Okay, so here we have foot number 20. I have a 20C on because I'm working on a 9mm feed dog machine. I have my blanket stitch set up with a 3 width and a 3 length. My needle position has been moved to the far right. I am going to follow the inside toe of this foot with the raw edge of my blanket stitch, or the raw edge of my applique, sorry. And that's where I'm going to keep the raw edge of my applique, is on the inside toe. We're going to stitch, the machine is going to sew forward, over, back, and then forward again. We want to make sure that if we need to change direction or pivot, we do so when the needle comes back to the outside edge of the applique. We don't want to pivot while our needle is in the applique because then it will not line back up with the jump back into the edge of the fabric. Okay? I do stop with my needle in the down position, so my machine is set for that. I like to use my freehand system on my Bernina. I do not start directly in the corner. I come down a little bit from the corner. And let's sew. Now I am using high contrast thread here so that you can see. You can see that as I'm sewing, it's not a fast thing. I want to sew at a nice, slow, steady pace, keeping that fabric lined up right there. approach the corner, I'm going to take it just a little bit slower because my goal is to finish on the outside edge of my applique here, right at the point. Okay, it's going to take a jump forward. That's going to be pretty close to the corner of my applique. I'm going to rotate my fabric. Okay, actually, you know what? I'm going to take like half a stitch here. I'm going to raise my needle and I'm going to put my needle back down. So I'm not even going to take a stitch. Okay, I'm then going to get right into the corner. I'm going to rotate so that my next stitch goes into the point and then back. Now, I don't want it to come straight forward because that's going to be off the edge. So I'm going to then pivot so that it does next to my applique. And then we're going to continue on. We're going to stitch down this side to the other point. Approaching the other corner, taking it slow. Perfect. Could not have planned that any better. Pivot so that the next stitch over into the applique is going to go right at the point. Back out and then pivot so that I can round my corner. Now I'm coming back to where I started. I just want to watch that. Now, my next jump is going to come forward and connect the two ends. Let me get this out of the way. Okay. I'm going to activate the knot function on my machine so that it will tie a knot when it finishes this stitch. If you don't have a knot function, I don't really like to backstitch in a blanket stitch because then one section is much thicker than the other. If you don't have a knot, I would pull, raise your needle in your foot, pull a long tail, and then pull your tails to the back side of your fabric and hand tie a knot. So there's a knot. And then there's a knot. Okay, I'm going to cut that. Come back over here so that you can see. That's the goal. The goal is you should not see the straight of that blanket stitch in any location. And if you move that needle position over and take it slow, you will be happy with results. You're going to do this to all 12 petals. Once all 12 petals are finished, you're going to lay out your quilt like they show in the diagram, and you're going to sew them together. Okay. Here's what I would change. It's only a 36 by 36 inch table topper, and if you're not real super good at 1/4 of an inch and you don't want to lose the tips of your petals, I would go ahead and pre-assemble the center of the quilt. Go ahead and sew the background squares together before you do any fusing of your petals. That way your 1/4 inch is already taken into account. You can get your background all pieced, and then you'll be able to lay that petal directly into the corner. Okay, but in that same manner, you have to be comfortable being able to manipulate all of this underneath of your machine while you are blanket stitching. I blanket stitched after it was pieced. And how I did it is I just started and I went around all of that one color and then started back and came back the other direction. Okay? So I wasn't turning the quilt 180 or 360 degrees every petal. I just followed the outside edge. My centers come like this, went like this, did figure eights, and then only really the green petals had to be done completely rotating because there's nothing that they touch that matches. But they're in the 4 outside corners. So if you're not a super fan of your 1/4 of an inch and you want to make sure that the center of your topper is dead on, okay, I would suggest piecing all the background squares together and then laying your fusibles on top and ironing them down. It's going to help you be able to make sure that everything comes together. Like, for example, that one's just like a 1/16 of an inch, a little short. It just needed to be rotated slightly, and that would have been a much closer join. So I think you can be a little bit more accurate if you piece all your background together and then fuse and blanket stitch your petal shapes. Now, once your petal shapes are appliqued, you're going to follow your instructions on page 2 to create your strip set using the strips that you cut and sewing yourself a strip set that you will then cut to create this pieced border. Okay. These segments get cut into 2.5 inches in width. And we're going to follow the instructions to create 4 borders the same length, okay, with a cornerstone in the corner, okay. So we create 4 borders the same length, and then we attach to 2 sides, and then 2 of the borders get a cornerstone attached, and then you can sew it together, just like it shows. Once your quilt top is assembled, you are ready for layering and quilting. The example on the front cover, or here in this graphic image, is a perfect example of how I would quilt this project. You have in the center pink background area. They've done some all over free motion. Inside the petals, they've stitched approximately a 1/2 inch away from the blanket stitching and then done some additional quilting. And then in the outside edge, it's just straight lines. This is the perfect project if you've been experimenting or wanting to maybe play with some ruler work, because you can easily stitch that petal with curved rulers. The straight lines on the outside edge can be done with a straight ruler. And then you just have a little bit of free motion that happens right there in the center of your project in the light pink background area. Or you could even do additional ruler work, or maybe even some stitching in the ditch if free motion is not your thing. Well, I hope that was helpful. I look forward to seeing your finished projects and finished table toppers. Hopefully ours will be here quilted soon. And if you have any questions, please reach out to us and we'll be happy to assist you in finishing up your project. Thank you and have a great day.